Imagine a beehive, a perfect, self-governing machine, right up until a 12th century bishop attempts to legally delete its right to exist. In this explainer of medieval legal history, we're unpacking the blueprint of a spiritual lawsuit against insects. When the system can't control the swarm, it actually tries to sue the soul of the hive. This isn't a fable, it's documented jurisprudence. We're looking at a profound collision between human legal frameworks and the unyielding forces of nature.
The Middle Ages operated on a singular, rigid source code. The Church sat as the absolute arbiter at the apex of all secular and sacred existence. Reality simply wasn't an ecosystem of competing biology. It was expected to be as orderly as perfectly planted rows of wheat or tethered beasts, a hierarchy of divine will governed by laws that left absolutely no room for natural anarchy. Every creature, no matter how small, was expected to fall in line with this strict architecture. To deviate from this structure wasn't just an act of nature, it was an act of rebellion against the divine order itself.
So, when crops failed or swarms of beetles descended to devastate a harvest, authorities didn't view it as a mere biological event. In a world defined by absolute divine order, bad weather or bad luck simply didn't exist. A swarm devouring a year's food supply was a severe legal crisis. It demanded a judicial response. The authorities found themselves caught in a terrifying theological trap between respecting the creations of God and mitigating their wanton destructiveness. The psychological weight of a pest invasion threatened not just the physical survival of a community, but the very ideological foundation of their universe.
Faced with a natural world refusing to obey human order, the Church deployed ecclesiastical excommunication. Think of this as a structural glitch in medieval theology, used as a spiritual lawsuit to threaten nature with eternal damnation. It was a literal attempt to hack reality. The physical world had stopped making sense. It was behaving with a chaotic violence that completely defied holy law. So, to assert dominance over the physical realm, medieval courts turned to the ultimate weapon. They didn't just reach for fire or poison to solve their pest problems, they reached for the law. To truly understand how an empire sues a swarm, we have to examine the anathema. Derived from the Greek for the thing held up, an anathema was no mere scolding. It was a ritualized curse. It functioned as a spiritual execution. By completely cutting the target off from the body of the faithful, it became a devastating spiritual weapon, a formal, terrifying severing of the physical creature from the divine order itself. To a medieval mind, this severing meant casting the creature into the absolute void, literally stripping it of its God-given right to exist within the physical universe. Consider the events of 1124. When St. Bernard of Clairvaux grew irritated by a swarm of flies in the abbey church of Foigné, he didn't simply swat them. He formally excommunicated the insects before the entire congregation. And this established an ingenious, bulletproof system where the authorities couldn't possibly lose. Notice the terrifying self-sealing logic here. If the flies died or left, the ritual was deemed a divine success. If they stayed, the infestation was seamlessly blamed on human sin, demanding deeper penance from the terrified peasants. The structural integrity of the Church's power remained flawless, perfectly insulated from the unpredictability of the natural world. This ritual served as the posthumous debugging of nature. It functioned as an ideological patch, designed to reconcile the existence of a perfect loving God with a wildly predatory, chaotic world. Through this debugging, a frightening reality was brought back into alignment with divine jurisprudence. It allowed the authorities to maintain the illusion of total control over the untamable. By prosecuting the beast, the medieval mind could sleep soundly, assured that the universe, no matter how brutal, was ultimately supervised by a rational, legally binding authority. But the mystery deepens when we weigh the stones themselves. Animals held a dual status within the courtroom walls. They weren't merely valued property to be compensated for when damaged or stolen. As the records show, they were viewed as moral actors capable of true wickedness. These weren't primitive superstitions. They were highly formal, procedural trials that recognized criminal agency in the non-human. A pig that trampled a child wasn't a tragic accident. It was a murderer, fully aware of its profound transgression against the laws of man and God.
By the 13th century, this legal framework metastasized, and the boundary between human and animal culpability vanished entirely. The scope of the law rapidly expanded. Following that initial excommunication of flies in 1124, we see a rooster formally burned at the stake in the 13th century for the unnatural, supposedly demonic crime of laying an egg. The system required a scapegoat for every deviation from the norm. It's a practice that built dark momentum across centuries, eventually culminating in 1522 with the infamous sweeping trial of the Rats of Autun.
The Rats of Autun had plundered the barley crops, pushing local peasants to the verge of a riot. Tasked with defending these elusive rodents, lawyer Bartholomew Deshaanus executed a masterful defense by aggressively weaponizing the court's own rigid procedures. First, he argued his dispersed clients couldn't hear the initial summons. Second, he demanded trial announcements from every pulpit in the diocese to ensure widespread notice. And when the rats still predictably failed to appear, he delivered an absolute masterstroke. He demanded safe passage to the court, arguing his clients must be legally protected from their mortal enemy, the cats of the village. The court was completely paralyzed by its own devotion to due process.
Realizing that spiritual condemnation couldn't magically erase every physical infestation, the system was forced to negotiate reality through what became known as the Stelvio Compromise. Logical bridges had to be built between the spiritual and the material. This compromise was a profound legal recognition. Insects and animals were God's own creatures, possessing a fundamental, undeniable right to eat. The law, with all its rigid arrogance, had to finally bend to biology. It adapted its austere code to accommodate the raw survival instincts of the crawling world. It was a stunning admission that nature possessed its own unassailable jurisdiction.
Judges began issuing startlingly modern rulings. In 1519, the mice of Stelvio were granted free and safe conduct. The court even went so far as to grant a 14-day stay of execution specifically for pregnant mice and infants to safely vacate the commune. Nearly 2 centuries later, in 1713, a Franciscan monastery in Brazil sued a colony of termites for destroying their furniture. The defense argued the termites had a prior claim to the land, and astoundingly, the court agreed. It ordered the monks to provide a dedicated protected habitat, commanding the termites to stay there or face the wrath of the anathema.
Systems invariably attempt to rewrite their own history to survive. By the 19th century, jurists desperately attempted to validate their own modern enlightenment. They abruptly dismissed these complex legal negotiations as the primitive rust of the Middle Ages. They painted a picture of narrow-minded judges and ridiculous, theatrical lawyers. But it was a convenient fiction. An eager attempt to completely distance themselves from a past that treated the swarm not merely as a mindless pest, but as an equal, conscious participant under the unyielding weight of the law. They sought to erase the profound philosophical questions their ancestors dared to ask.
Yet, the haunting desire to personify the beast persisted far beyond the medieval era. In 1919 London, a dog named Bobs was sentenced to death, sparking an international cause célèbre. Over 20,000 people signed a formal petition to reprieve the condemned animal. A high-profile barrister was hired at great expense to prove his innocence. Even in the modern age of science and reason, the urge to grant the beast a day in court, to project human morality onto animal behavior, remained deeply and permanently ingrained in the human psyche.
These ancient lawsuits were never truly about the insects, the rats, or the dogs. They were about patching the source code of a sacred system, navigating the no-man's land of responsibility. When the natural world went into full revolt, when crops failed mysteriously and sudden chaos reigned, hacking the world by threatening it with the void was the only way to maintain the vital illusion of control. It was a desperate, monumental attempt to bridge the uncrossable gap between the desire for perfect human justice and the grim reality of natural, biological chaos.
A world where a beehive can exist outside the law is a world the system simply cannot own. If you have ever felt the machinery of the world's glitch in a way that feels intensely personal, you're living in the shadow of a 700-year-old lawsuit. As we confront a natural world that still absolutely refuses to be fully controlled, we are left to endlessly weigh the heavy legacy of the anathema anamada. If an animal kills a human today, is it a crime or just a glitch in the environment?